my senior's research project was on can contemplative practices help us to become more compassionate. So over the last year and a half, I've been getting more interested in contemplative practices and the benefits of them, how they can help us to take ourselves out of the busyness of our minds and our own thinking and become more present to those around us, to the present moment. So yeah, I wanted to look at contemplative practices and eventually decided to look at whether they can help us to become more compassionate. And at first I was kind of doubtful whether I would find that much information on this, but I found so much, and this research project has just led me on a big adventure of discovery. And yeah, I believe that they can help us to become more compassionate. And I'm excited to share with you how that is so. So I looked at this research question through various lenses: psychology, spirituality, and neurology. And I looked at several contemplative practices: Buddhist mindfulness, Christian mindfulness, Christian centering prayer, and loving kindness meditation. And I wanted to look at a mixture of secular and religious practices to draw comparisons between the effects of contemplative prayer and their objectives. So first, I'm going to look at mindfulness. So mindfulness is about stilling ourselves, quietening ourselves, and becoming aware of ourselves, of our feelings and our thinking, our surroundings, and of seeing and perceiving with honesty and with compassion. And there's an emphasis on non-judgmental observation. So even if you have a negative thought or feeling, not to judge this, but to accept it and to have love for yourself. And also an emphasis on open attention to the present moment. So coming out of your own thinking and just being present. And it is in this place where Jung would say you meet your shadow self. So this is the dark side of our personality. So what we consider evil, corrupt, and unacceptable, which we're not proud of about ourselves. And we have to delve deep inside ourselves with total honesty in order to confront this side of ourselves. Because usually, we don't want to, our ego doesn't want to pay attention to those things which it doesn't like about ourselves. So we really have to just, take a step back, quieten ourselves, and come to terms with that. And it can be difficult and humiliating. But doing this helps to diminish our pride and our self-righteousness. It's a humbling experience. And the aim is to generate love and compassion and acceptance for ourselves despite anything else. And it is from this place that we are able to extend love and compassion to others. So, just loving ourselves unconditionally, despite our faults. And, others have faults too, so you see that you're both the same. It doesn't matter. Once we do this, there's less need to be defensive towards ourselves and our faults, and it reduces the need for us to draw attention to the faults of those around us and to project our own faults onto them. So I'm now going to look at mindfulness from a Buddhist mysticism point of view. The main source I used for this was Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now. I love this book. So he says that mindfulness is about coming into the present moment, freeing ourselves from the repetitive, habitual, and self-focused ways of our thinking. Because if you actually really observe your thinking, it is like this, and there's a statistic that says 90% of our thoughts are repetitive and useless. I can say more about that that time. So it is the ego that resists letting go of the talkative mind. The ego is our consciousness of our own identity, of I, of me. And it resists coming into the peace and stillness of the present moment. It likes the focus to be on itself. So, in order to quieten our minds and our ego, we need to observe and become aware of our thoughts. And Toll says an amazing thing happens here. We find our deeper self. He says, it is by watching the thinker and observing our thoughts that we are able to come to a higher level of consciousness. Once we pay attention to our thinking, we observe that there is a greater intelligence behind our thoughts, behind our mind. Because there's a deeper self that is observing your thoughts and your thinking. And he says that you need to realize that you're not your thoughts, or like your mind. There's something deeper there. And it's through contemplation, contemplative prayer, mindfulness that you're able to find this. So it's at this point that I can draw some similarities between Buddhist mindfulness and Christian mindfulness centering prayer. So Buddhism describes the deeper self as something that almost paradoxically is essentially you and yet is much greater than you. So Christians might describe this as your soul or spirit. Buddhism explains that when we contemplate, we become aware of the eternal, ever-present one life beyond the myriad forms of life. Christians might call this God. As I was just saying, in Buddhism there's an emphasis on stopping identifying with your ego and your mind in order to get into contact, discover your deeper self, and become aware of that eternal, ever-present one life. In Christianity, there's an emphasis on death to self, our ego, in order to live from our deeper self, our true self, which is found in God. And I've also got a quote from Richard Rohr. Great. Major fan. He says, when we begin to contemplate, our thinking self, which experiences being other than God, dissolves away. What is left is a meditative self, which is one with God. So again, you can see in Buddhism and Christianity, or what Rohr is saying, is it's about getting away from our thinking. And it's difficult to kind of discover our deeper self, like find God in like our consciousness. And it's almost like you have to come out of that, and those things are found in your unconscious. I think that's how I think to put it, yeah. So again, back to Buddhism. Toll says, when you're being mindful, you can feel the same life deep within every other human and every other creature. You look beyond the veil of form and separation. This is the realization of oneness. This is love. So the ego, which we can think of as I or me, likes to emphasize otherness and separateness from others. So it therefore makes sense that when we free ourselves from our ego, we move away from this sense of me, and it becomes more we, and we feel this oneness which Toll refers to. And I find it really interesting that he's saying that it is in this place of unity that there is love, as it's not so much about me, there's that lack of self-focusedness. And in Christianity, we know that prayer and contemplation is about becoming one with God in heart, mind and spirit. And the Bible says God is love. So when we encounter God, we encounter love. And when we fill ourselves up with God, we fill ourselves up with love. So again, like kind of similar as what Toll is saying here about encountering love. And we also know that we are all one in Christ and that there's unity in God. So my conclusion was that each tradition that I looked at has its own way of explaining and wording what contemplative practices achieve, and the underlying explanation of this is the same. And in my seniors research project, I look at more contemplative practices, and I look at these ones in more detail, but I can't go through them all now, so you have to read it. But I did want to mention Jung's psychodynamic theory and the collective unconscious and how it relates to this all. So Jung also believed that we are connected to other members of the human species through the collective unconscious. The human experience of archetypes, which are images and thoughts that have universal meanings, are present in our dreams, art, and culture. This is how Jung explained that there are quite often similar symbols between different cultures. So perhaps this is why we see similar underlying ideas in Buddhism and Buddhist, Christian, and secular points of view regarding mindfulness and contemplative practices. We are all aware of something much greater than this oneness with God, deep connectedness to others, etc., deep in the unconscious. And perhaps it is here too where we discover our spiritual selves in God. Jung did, after all, believe that the collective unconscious was spiritual too. So that was really cool. And I've got a cool neurological study to share with you, which relates to what I was just talking about. So Newberg scanned the brain of a Tibetan Buddhist who had meditated for at least an hour for the past 40 years. When the Buddhist meditated, his parietal lobes went dark. These lobes are an area of the brain that usually takes in sensory information and helps us to create a sense of self and orientate that self in the world. Newberg explained, quote, "When people lose their sense of self, feel a sense of oneness, a blurring of the boundary between self and other, we have found decreases in activity in that area," end quote. So Newberg discovered this same occurrence in the brains of other monks, in Franciscan nuns while praying, and Sikhs while chanting too. They reported that they all felt a sense of oneness with the universe. So this is just neurological evidence that contemplation does help one to break down the barrier which separates us from others, and it helps to diminish one's sense of self and the ego. And the unity experience kindles greater compassion. These are like the nuns, the monks, are people with high levels of compassion. And I found it cool too that no matter the religion, the effects of contemplation were the same. So how is it possible that our brain is able to change just by contemplating? The idea behind this is neuroplasticity. So, through thought and activity, our brains are able to alter its structure and function by forming new neural connections. So even something like contemplation can do this. And there's another meditative practice which has some interesting links here. Loving kindness meditation, LKM. So this practice involves quietly and systematically sending loving and compassionate thoughts without negative and judgmental thoughts to others. So first, sending these to ourselves, to friends and family, and then to strangers and those who we don't get on well with. And this actually helps build compassion for these people. And so one study discovered that those who had practiced LKM in the Theravada tradition for at least 5 years had more grey matter volume in the right angular and posterior gyrus than novices. And these are areas associated with empathic response, anxiety, and mood. And there have been many other studies that have shown that LKM rewires the brain by engaging neural connections linked to empathy. So how is it that sending out compassionate thoughts to others actually helps to change the brain and make us more compassionate? We tend to view imagination and action as completely different, running under different rules. However, both mental imagery and physical actions use the same motor program in the brain. And so, imagining sending out loving and compassionate thoughts to family, friends, strangers, etc. is actually to the brain the same as being compassionate to these people. We are therefore able to strengthen these neural pathways through the use of our imagination. These neural pathways will continue to be strengthened to the point that our actual behavior and actions have changed. So we can use contemplative practices to become more consistently compassionate people. And neurological studies show that contemplative practices do literally alter and change our brains in ways that enable us to become more compassionate people. And the more we take part in such practices, the more we will move in this direction due to the continual rewiring of the brain. And in my research, I found that intentionality towards becoming more compassionate is very important too. It makes a difference. But I believe ultimately that we are able to become compassionate by moving away from our ego, taking the focus off of ourselves and connecting with something much larger than ourselves in the science of contemplation or meditation, whether that be called our true selves, unity with others, love, or God. So may we all enrich in our lives and the lives of others and become more compassionate through the use of contemplative practices. Okay. I did put in another slide for questions, but it's not there. So I'll try and answer any questions. Yes.
It's kind of a comment. I've been doing some research and learning more about the impact of technology on our brains and social media and our overwhelming digital clutter. And it just is interesting to hear you talk about the rewiring of the brain in that respect, because right now, those under the age of 35 spend an average of 5 hours on a device a day, their smartphones. Those over the age of 35 often spend more, which is surprising. And that's rewiring our brains. But I know that probably wasn't a focus of your research, but I just find that connection between moving away from the ego, which in reality our technology often enhances our focus on ourselves, and moving into contemplative practices, to me, seems even more significant. Not that it wasn't significant before, but that we actually are facing something. They're tools, I don't think they're all bad, but they are actually rewiring our brains in certain ways, using some of these technologies. And so to understand how significant it is to interact with these practices that can actually help combat that, but also move us towards being more compassionate. That is just something I've been reading about even this morning. I was looking at something. So I don't know if you have thoughts on, like, as you were doing this, did it make you think, just as a student who is a millennial, even doing research on your computer or being connected in that way with technology, has this changed how you interact with some of those mediums?
No, actually, I don't really think about it from the technology point of view, but I think I was just thinking about the general busyness of our lives these days and just how we're just always so busy. And yeah, I guess even social media, how that can be a distraction to actually sit down and contemplate, but even how we're just always running from one thing to the next, myself included. Yeah, and I do wonder just how different our interactions with people would be, or like the world would be if we actually did. If we were more silent and still and looked inside ourselves and contemplated. I think it would be better. Yeah. Yes.
Now, probably any little bit of contemplative practice is good, but better than none at all, right? I just wondered if what research you came across about, like, if there was a certain amount of, contemplation that really starts to rewire the brain more than just doing a few minutes here and there when you can,
So you're asking like what length of time you would need to contemplate for?
Yeah, anything like that.
I didn't properly look into that, but I came across some studies, and I looked at so many studies, that I know after 8 weeks, I can't remember how long they would have contemplated for, but even that makes a difference. Yeah, I don't know exactly what time is best to sit down and contemplate. Yeah.
As long as we do it for 8 weeks. That's what matters.
Yeah, and I think definitely the more you do it, the more time you spend doing it, the more you'll change, your brain will change. I don't want to always just make it about the brain and the kind of biological side of it, but because I like the spiritual side too, but they're all connected. But yeah, I think just generally, I can't think of any studies, but yeah, Yes.
My question was going to be along similar lines. One study that I heard of, which isn't related to contemplative practice, but just practice in general, was something about a study done for people who, let's say musicians who were well practiced, a seasoned musician. They'd spent 10 years playing an instrument versus someone who was just learning, and they gave them an exercise to imagine themselves practicing versus like actually practicing, and something along the lines of the seasoned musician can engage and develop and practice and maintain their skill just by imagining it. But somebody who hasn't had as much practice developing it, they need to do it physically for a period of time. So I think there's this whole idea of practice that is involved. And even, I guess, the brain study of the novice monk versus a senior monk. The novice monk would have been engaged in some of the same practices as the senior monk, but why is the senior one further along? I guess it must be the amount of time. So.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you the same question with some of those thoughts, but I just thought I'd share this.
No, that's really cool. Yeah, and I found it really interesting when I came across even just imagining, being more compassionate to people. Like that helps. Just again, like imagination. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, along those lines too, but it's maybe not a question either. But maybe you have more to say after. I think I had a little bit of like a ding moment of thinking of myself, imagining compassion, and then that's similar to actually acting, like being with that person and acting on that. I'm just wondering if you came across the opposite of that in like really ruminating over a negative experience and having bad feelings towards someone. I can see how that would really carve that pathway strongly in your brain and make it like a vicious cycle of being true with how you interact with them. And I wonder if you saw any of that, or maybe you just looked at the more positive side.
I only looked at the positive, but I guess even just thinking about our own lives, maybe, or me just thinking about mine, I can, maybe just the way you think about people, and like if you're thinking negatively towards them, then that's going to like impact how you act towards them. But
it wasn't really a question. Just I can see how that would work in both ways, and that you could really practice in prayer and in that it would really affect you, not just the person you're trying to pray for.
I think like anything affects your brain, any kind of like emotion or feeling, and even I didn't mention it, but like contemplative practices, they have an effect on one's stress levels. So what I was going to say is last year I looked at neuroplasticity in terms of how stress affects the brain, and like that knock-on effects of like any kind of emotion, I think, can like change the brain and its function. So that's why we should stay positive. Yeah.
Speaking of staying positive, or not really actually, with Jung's notion of the shadow, I guess I'm curious as to how that plays into contemplative practices, because I guess that has a lot to do with sort of drudging up like sort of the darker elements of our personality, which I think is really important in a lot of ways, but I guess it seems like that would throw a wrench in meditation often if you're sort of trying to calm yourself and you're thinking of all these sort of aspects of yourself that you haven't necessarily recognized before. I guess what I'm trying to ask is like, what do you do with these sort of darker aspects of yourself once you've pulled them to the surface?
Well, like I said that, that wasn't meant to sound bad, but it's about like accepting those things. so even those negative qualities about ourselves, like just trying to have acceptance and loving ourselves despite those things. And we just did a counselling course with Walter, and I remember him saying, I'm not sure if this is answering your question, I don't know, it just came into my head, but how you can think of all the voices in your head like a congregation, and each voice is important and should be heard. And even like the negative voice might have something more interesting to say than the positive voice. But I can't remember what your question was now. But were you asking like how it can help us to become more compassionate?
Yeah, I suppose so. Or just how do we? Yeah, I guess. How does that acceptance actually play out? I guess. How do we? I mean, maybe that's an impossible question to answer or whatever. But yeah, it just seems difficult to like. It seems like a bit of a balance to sort of think of these like sort of negative aspects of ourselves with positive aspects, but sort of reduce the self at the same time. I don't know. I don't know what the question is.
Yeah, I don't. I think sometimes in Buddhism it seems like it is kind of reducing the self, like, oh, just like trying to eliminate these, maybe it's like specifically what kind of Buddhist you are, like how to eliminate these like negative feelings. But I think it doesn't always have to be about that. It can just be about accepting them, loving yourself. And I think again, like just kind of acknowledging that you're like broken, and then like if you can have like compassion for yourself, then you can have compassion for others. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm an internal process. I was going to say something else, but I can't remember. Maybe too, it's just about like filling yourself with love. That sounds really cheesy, but like positivity. And again, I remember Walter saying in a sermon like last year about needing to, in order to, I think we were talking about compassion or becoming more loving, in order to create more of that in your life. You know, you can't just try and love others. You have to also love yourself. You have to feel love like more sweet. Yeah, Andy.
Well, addressing that same thing, if you think of yourself as being perfect, then you're going to be judgmental of other people. So what you're doing is looking at the opposite and saying, if I look at myself, I am, under certain circumstances, capable of great evil myself.
Yeah.
And if I could just accept that, then I'm not going to be as judgmental as somebody else. Maybe that.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I'm just really bad at like things. But I think like in my life too, like those like kind of confronting those negative things about myself. Like I'm not trust. I still like have, you know, more to go on the journey to becoming like more non-judgmental. But I think it has definitely helped me to be less judgmental to others, and like try and understand their like thoughts and why they might have those, and not to just instantly be like, oh, you're such a terrible person. Yeah, of course I have my stuff too. Yes. Hang on. Yeah, you and then Lorna.
Sorry.
Yes.
So, like as a student pastor and someone who works a lot with like all the isms, like I'm constantly wondering like how do you enable people to be more compassionate? So you're talking about these contemplative practices. So are there things that we can do within our faith circles to encourage, like how would you suggest maybe incorporating contemplative practice into like a Sunday worship service, or like other practical things that we can do to try to foster compassion? That's probably a big question.
And I hope I answer it. But I think just kind of more, I don't know, I've always thought, I've been reading about like kind of the interaction between psychology and spirituality. I've been interested in that for a while, but I've kind of thought, why don't I hear more about this in Christianity, and how we can like use like our minds and these kind of practices to help us spiritually. So I think even just kind of making it more of a conversation in Christianity. And I quite like it in St. Croix, because once a month they do have all of those practical talks, which is where you're able to talk about like how to become more compassionate yourself. And then I think just actually just doing it too, just keeping on praying, being contemplative, like just encouraging others to do that too. Put emphasis on it. Yeah.
I feel like bringing more silence into a service would be good.
Yeah.
Like it's so filled with things. And
I think it'd be like good to do it as a group, but also just even individually, just by yourself too.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't always have to be in the church service. I want to say Lorna because she had a hand up.
Probably just last question.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, Hannah, are there specific contemplative practices that you found most helpful for yourself in this opening up to compassion to yourself and others?
Maybe you should let me practice a little bit more before I say
I'm not saying I think you're perfect, although maybe. But I'm just saying we're all in process. So what are some of the things that have helped you to feel like there's some movement in this area?
For like I don't know, a few days or like a week, I did try out the loving kindness meditation because I was intrigued by it, and I think that one did help. But in terms of becoming more compassionate, I think just kind of centering myself, like centering prayer, just centering myself in God. Just meeting Him, I think. It's just a mixture, and then like kind of becoming more mindful about like my like weaknesses or like how I've acted, and then being like, okay, I need to improve on that. So just like a mixture of them all, really. I don't think I can say one is better than the other, but they all have to do different things.